Lagos was a city full of life, a place where the streets never truly slept. During the day, the roads were filled with cars honking, people rushing to work, and traders shouting their prices in the crowded markets. But at night, the city changed. Some places were peaceful, with families gathering for dinner and saying their prayers, while other parts came alive with nightlife, music, and secrets hidden behind closed doors. In the heart of this busy, restless city was St. Peter's Catholic Church, one of the biggest and most respected churches in Lagos. It was not just a place of worship, it was a symbol of power, influence, and tradition. People came from far and wide to attend Sunday Mass, seeking prayers, miracles, and guidance. And among them was Judith, the perfect church girl. Judith was born and raised in the church. Her parents were devoted Catholics who never missed a Mass, never skipped morning and evening prayers, and made sure their children followed the same path. Her father, a strict businessman, always said, "Discipline and faith will take you far in life." Her mother, a gentle but firm woman, often reminded her, "God sees everything. Fear him, and you will never go astray." Because of this, Judith grew up knowing only one way of life, the church way. At just 10 years old, she became an altar server, assisting the priest during Massachusetts. By the time she was 15, she had risen to the position of vice president of the altar servers, responsible for training the younger ones, arranging the altar, and ensuring the priests had everything they needed before Mass began. She loved the church. It felt like home. Her best friend in the church was Frank, a boy she had grown up with. Wherever you saw Judith, you saw Frank. They had been serving together for as long as she could remember. Frank was the one person who truly understood her. "Judith, keep your eyes on God. He never fails," Frank would always say. And she believed it, until she met Father Donald. Father Donald was not yet a fully ordained priest. He was a seminarian, still undergoing training. But in St. Peter's Catholic Church, people already respected him like a priest. He was young, handsome, and intelligent. He spoke with wisdom beyond his years, and every time he preached, people listened. Women admired him. Men respected him. The youth looked up to him. Whenever someone had a problem, they went to him. "Father, my business is failing. Father, my marriage is in trouble. Father, I want to be a better Christian." And he would smile warmly, place a gentle hand on their shoulder, and say, "Let's pray together." Judith, like everyone else, admired him. How could she not? He was a man of God, a man who seemed closer to heaven than the rest of them. So when he asked her for a favor, she didn't think twice about it. The first warning. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The church was quiet, empty except for a few people praying. Judith had just finished arranging the altar when she heard someone call her name. "Judith, come." She turned to see Father Donald standing near the side door of the church, smiling. "Yes, Father," she answered quickly. "I need your help," he said warmly. "Of course, Father. Come and help me clean my room." The request sounded simple. Why would she refuse? He was a man of God. She followed him to the small private rooms behind the church, where the priests and seminarians stayed. When they entered, she looked around. The room was already clean. The bed was neatly made, the desk was clear, and the floor was spotless. Something felt strange, but she ignored it. She picked up a cloth and started wiping down the table. Then, she felt it, a hand on her waist. She froze. For a second, she thought, "No, I must be imagining it. Maybe he was just reaching for something." But then, his fingers pressed into her waist, slow and deliberate. Her heart began to pound. She stepped away immediately and turned to face him. He was smiling. "You're such a good girl, Judith. Always so helpful," he said. She forced a nervous laugh, grabbed her bag, and left the room as fast as she could, trying to ignore the truth. That night, she lay in bed thinking. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was nothing. But her body had reacted. Her skin had crawled when he touched her. Her instincts had screamed at her to run. And yet, he was a man of God. She convinced herself that it was just an accident. She continued her duties at church as usual, but she made sure to never be alone with Father Donald again. At least, that's what she thought. Because 2 weeks later, it happened again. The second warning. It was a Sunday after Massachusetts. Judith was helping to pack up the altar, and the church was still full of people chatting and laughing. She felt a hand touch her shoulder. She turned. It was Father Donald. "Judith, please follow me," he said. She hesitated. Something in her gut told her not to go. "It's important," he added. She forced a small smile and followed him. But this time, he took her somewhere different. Instead of leading her to his room behind the church, he took her upstairs to the private meeting rooms, where only the priests and senior church members were allowed. She hesitated at the door. "Father, I should get back to the altar." "Just for a minute," he said, stepping inside and motioning for her to follow. Slowly, she stepped in. The door closed behind her. Click! He had locked it. Her heart dropped. She turned to look at him. His expression had changed. Gone was the gentle, priestly smile. Now his eyes were dark, and he was standing too close. She took a step back. "Father, I should go." "Why are you afraid?" he asked, his voice calm. Her mouth felt dry. She couldn't answer. Then he reached out and touched her face. She felt cold all over. "You don't have to be afraid, Judith," he whispered. She yanked herself away and ran to the door. She twisted the handle, but it was locked. "Father, please open the door," she begged. For a moment, he just watched her. Then he sighed and unlocked it. She rushed out without looking back. But she still didn't tell anyone, because who would believe her? After all, he was a holy man, a man of God. But deep down she knew this was only the beginning. Judith tried to pretend nothing had happened. She continued going to church. She prayed harder than ever. She smiled when people greeted her, acted normal during altar service, and never told a soul about what had happened. But deep down she was scared. Every time she saw Father Donald, she felt like she couldn't breathe. His eyes always seemed to linger on her, watching her like a predator studying its prey. And then, one Sunday evening, everything changed forever. That evening, the sky was dark with heavy clouds, and the air smelled like rain. The church was half empty, as most people had gone home after the last evening mass. Judith was cleaning up the altar when she heard someone call her name. "Judith, come." She turned around and saw the altar server's president, a senior member of the youth group. "Father Donald needs his room cleaned. Go quickly," he said, barely looking at her before walking away. Judith's stomach twisted painfully. No, not again. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to run home immediately. But how could she? If she said no, people would start asking questions. And what would she say? That she didn't feel comfortable being alone with a man of God? Would anyone even believe her? She had no choice. Slowly, she walked towards the priest's private residence, her heart pounding with each step. When she arrived at his room, the door was already open, and Father Donald was waiting inside. "Come in," he said with a small smile. She hesitated, but then she stepped inside. As soon as she did, she heard it. Click. The door had been locked behind her. She spun around in fear. "Father, why did you lock the door?" she asked, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer. "Judith," he whispered, his voice calm, as if nothing was wrong. She backed away until her back hit the wall. "Father, please open the door," she begged. But he just smiled. And then, before she could scream, he grabbed her. She struggled. She fought with all her strength. She kicked, screamed, and begged, but no one was there to hear her. She twisted her body, trying to break free, but he was stronger. And then, the world went dark. She didn't know how long it lasted. She didn't know how she survived it. But when it was over, she lay there numb, broken, and shattered. Father Donald got up, straightened his priestly robe, and knelt beside her like he was praying. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Judith felt nothing. No tears came. No screams. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out some money. "Take this," he said, placing it beside her. "Buy pills. No one has to know." Judith stared at the money, ball rising in her throat. Money? He thought this could be fixed with money, like she was some problem that needed to be erased. Her hands shook violently as she pulled herself up. She grabbed her bag, her scarf, anything she could reach. And then she ran out of that room. Judith made it home that night, but something inside her had changed. She stopped speaking as much. She lost her appetite. She stayed in her room for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in her mind. And when her phone rang, she almost collapsed in fear. Father Donald's name was on the screen. She ignored it. Then came the text messages. Envelope with arrow. Judith, please talk to me. We need to sort this out. Envelope with arrow. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Envelope with arrow. Please don't tell anyone. She deleted the messages. But the damage was already done. A few weeks passed. She tried to act normal, but everything felt wrong. Then, she started feeling sick. At first, she ignored it. Maybe it was stress. Maybe she was just tired. But then, her appetite changed. Food she used to love made her want to throw up. She felt dizzy in the mornings. Her body felt heavy and strange. And then, her period didn't come. 1 week passed. Then 2 weeks. She told herself it was nothing. But deep down she knew. Then, one morning, she ran to the bathroom and threw up violently. Her mother knocked on the door. Judith, are you okay? She wiped her mouth and forced herself to sound normal. Yes, Mommy. I think I ate something bad. But she knew the truth. She was pregnant. That afternoon, she skipped school and took a bus to a faraway pharmacy. She couldn't risk buying the pregnancy test near her home. Her hands shook violently as she handed the money to the cashier. She stuffed the test in her bag and rushed home. Her heart pounded as she locked herself in the bathroom. She took a deep breath. She followed the instructions. She waited. Then, 2 pink lines appeared. Positive. She took another test. Still positive. She took a third test. The same result. She collapsed to the floor, her chest tightening. No, no, no. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. She pressed her hands to her stomach. Tears blurred her vision. What was she going to do? Who could she tell? Who would believe her? That evening, Frank found her sitting outside St. Peter's Church, staring into nothing. Judith, what's wrong? He asked, concerned. She wanted to lie. She wanted to say nothing. But before she could stop herself, the words spilled out. Frank, I'm pregnant. Frank froze. Then his entire face changed. What? He whispered, his voice barely audible. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Frank's hands clenched into fists. Who did this to you? She sucked in a sharp breath. Father Donald. Silence. Frank just stared at her. Then, his whole body trembled with rage. I swear to God, I will kill him. Judith grabbed Frank's arm before he could storm off. Her hands were shaking. You can't. Why not? His breathing was heavy, his entire body trembling with fury. He ruined your life, Judith. His voice broke. Judith tightened her grip on his arm. Frank, please. He looked down at her, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed like his teeth might crack. But slowly he sat back down, rubbing his face with both hands. For a long time, he didn't speak. Neither did she. They just sat there in silence, surrounded by the weight of everything. After what felt like forever, he finally whispered, What are you going to do? Judith let out a shaky breath. I don't know. How was she supposed to know? She was 15, pregnant, and the father was a priest. She couldn't tell her parents. They would never believe her. The church? They worshipped him. The community? They would call her a liar. She was trapped. Absolutely trapped. Frank clenched his fists again. We have to do something. We can't just let this happen. Like what? She whispered. Tell people? Who will believe me? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer, because they both knew the truth. No one would take her side. Father Donald was too loved, too respected, too holy. And Judith? She was just a girl who would be called a liar, a sinner, a temptation. Frank let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. This is so messed up. He's supposed to be a man of God. Judith wiped her tears. That doesn't mean anything. Not anymore. She had seen the devil, and he wore a white collar. Frank took a deep breath, then turned to her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. Judith. Something in his tone made her stomach tighten. What? He hesitated. Then, in a voice so low she almost didn't hear him, he said, You don't have to keep it. For a second, she didn't understand. Then her entire body went cold. She pulled back, staring at him. What? He held her gaze. You can get rid of it. Her heart stopped. She blinked, waiting for him to say he was joking. But he wasn't. Frank. Her voice was barely a whisper. Judith, think about it. His voice was desperate now. If you keep this baby, your life is over. Your parents will disown you. The church will shame you. No one will ever look at you the same way again. She shook her head rapidly. No, I can't. Why not? His voice rose slightly. Why should you have to suffer for what he did? Why should you be the one to pay the price? She couldn't breathe. She couldn't even think. Her hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself. I don't know. Frank leaned closer, his voice urgent. Judith, you have to be smart about this. You can't keep this baby. You can't. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head harder. Stop. I'm trying to help you. By telling me to kill my baby? Her voice cracked. He flinched. For the first time, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. She took a deep breath, her chest tight. I can't, Frank. I can't. Then what are you going to do? His voice was almost breaking now. Raise it, hide it, give birth, and let everyone turn their backs on you. She didn't have an answer, because she didn't know. She didn't know anything anymore. She pressed her hands to her face. This was a nightmare. A living, breathing nightmare. She wished she could wake up. She wished she could rewind time. She wished. Judith. She lowered her hands slowly. Frank was looking at her, his expression unreadable. If you keep it, he wins. Her stomach twisted. He swallowed hard. If you keep this baby, he gets away with everything. He'll still be a priest, still be respected, still be loved. And you'll be the girl who ruined her life. The girl no one believes. The girl they whisper about in church. Tears burn her eyes. Frank, please stop. I'm just telling you the truth. She wanted to scream. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to stop existing. Frank exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He looked broken. I don't want to see you suffer, Judith. I really don't. Then don't make me do this. Her voice was raw. He sighed heavily, rubbing his face. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, just think about it. She looked away, her heart pounding. She didn't want to think about it. She didn't even want to breathe. But deep down, she knew this nightmare was far from over.